All right, so starting out in Unit 4, we are now talking about the Young Republic. So this is the nation after Washington, after Adams, and how is the nation expanding and growing in the first 30 years of the 19th century? So with the election of 1800, Aaron Burr, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams are all the major candidates up against one another. Which you can imagine based on our discussions before, Aaron Burr doesn't really like Jefferson. Jefferson and Adams really don't like each other, so it becomes a very contentious election. Thomas Jefferson ended up becoming the third president of the United States after the House of Representatives decided the election because there was a tie. Jefferson and Aaron Burr had exactly the same amount of votes, 73. John Adams followed with 65. Pinckney with 64, and John Jay with 1. So this is really important because the vote got split. And when the vote got split, obviously you have this tie come about. So the House of Representatives actually had to come in and be like, hey, we actually need to decide this. The Electoral College wasn't enough. So Jefferson won, Aaron Burr was angry, and Adams really lost because of those Alien and Sedition Acts. It was what it was. He kind of did it to himself. It was the first time that the House of Representatives had to decide an election, and it took days. It was not the last time, though. It happened in 1824 with Jackson versus John Quincy Adams, and then also Hayes versus Tilden in 1876. So fun facts there. So after realizing that there was a flaw in the Electoral College, Congress fixed the flaw by passing the 12th Amendment, which calls for having the electors cast the same ballot for president and vice president. So this is why we now have the concept of the presidential ticket, as opposed to first place gets president, second place gets vice president. So Jefferson's administration, he became the first president to take the oath of office in D.C. because D.C. was still being built during the other two presidencies. It's known as the Revolution of 1800 because it's the first peaceful transition of political power from one political party to the next. You have it moving from the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans. Jefferson believed in free trade with Europe, especially France. That shouldn't be very shocking after we've talked so much about Jefferson's love for France. He shrank the size of the federal government, but then he doubled the size of the United States. So he was a bit of a dichotomy there. He cut costs wherever and whenever possible because he didn't like spending a whole lot of money. At his inauguration, he said, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." Adams actually snuck out of D.C. and didn't hear this olive branch extended. He stayed mad at Jefferson for 12 more years. So it was a really nasty campaign against one another, and it really harmed their friendship. So this is what D.C. looked like mapped out when they were planning it. So you can see on the map how the Potomac River and everything blends in. The streets are on a grid pattern. You can see where Georgetown is actually laid out there. So this was the early plan for the city, and the city actually looks very similar to this early plan. And D.C. was founded on July 16, 1790, and established by the Constitution to serve as the nation's capital. This location was a compromise, with Hamilton and the northern states wanting the new federal government to assume Revolutionary War debts, and TJ and the southern states wanted the capital placed in a location that was friendly to slave-holding agricultural interests. So, compromise. Okay, John Marshall. He was appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by John Adams. He was appointed after John Jay retired, and the Federalists lost the executive and the legislative branches, so they wanted to hold on to the judicial. He also, fun fact, was Jefferson's cousin. He ended up serving on the Supreme Court for over 30 years, and he strengthened the power of the Supreme Court and the federal government. One of the first major cases of the Supreme Court is known as Marbury versus Madison in 1803. So John Adams signed the appointments of 16 new federal judges late on the last day of his administration. They're known as the Midnight Judges. So they were an attempt by Adams to keep Federalist judges in place before leaving office, and Jefferson refused to seat the very late judges. Some of the appointments were never delivered, and Jefferson believed that since they weren't, that they were invalid. So Marbury was one of these midnight judges who didn't get his appointment, and the Judiciary Act of 1789 required that the appointments be delivered, and Marbury sued to enforce this provision. Well, then came the Judiciary Act of 1801, which was during a lame duck period of Congress before the new Republicans were sworn in March. So that's roughly November to March that this lame duck Congress can just pass laws, and it doesn't really affect them because they're not going to be reelected. So John Marshall delivered the court's decision in Marbury versus Madison. Marshall did believe that Marbury deserved his commission, but not under the provision of the Judiciary Act of 1789 because it was unconstitutional. Therefore, the act was void, and so was Marbury's claim. So by doing this, Marshall and the Supreme Court were able to use the power of judicial review, which is just a massive expansion of judicial power. This is just one of Marshall's decisions to expand the power of the Supreme Court, and it's a lasting decision. Judicial review is the power of the Supreme Court to decide whether or not specific laws are valid. This made the court a co-equal branch because it sent the executive and legislative branches a message that the judicial branch had the power to affect legislation. So this was a huge check of their power and an establishment of the fact that the Supreme Court would be powerful. So Jefferson and his republicanism, Democratic Republicans were also called Jeffersonian Republicans. They believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution and limited federal government. They were pro-farmers, pro-states' rights. Jefferson's big policies were to eliminate the excise taxes, remember that whiskey tax, and lower the national debt and reduce the size of the military by about 50%. But then he started to expand his power. So, background info, TJ sent delegates to France to buy New Orleans for $10 million. Spain ended the port of entry rights at the mouth of the Mississippi River and secretly handed over the Louisiana Territory to France's Napoleon, who was dreaming of reestablishing an empire in North America. Napoleon then decided to sell the territory to the U.S. Napoleon offered the whole territory for $15 million, which is $233 million in today's money. Back then, 3 cents per acre, 42 cents per acre today. It's 800 square miles, and its actual worth today is over $1.2 trillion. Although the Constitution doesn't say that the president could purchase foreign land, Jefferson agreed to the deal, which is a very loose interpretation and hypocritical. And he says it's implied powers. This supports Jefferson's view of an agrarian society of farmers by giving them more land. I mean, it literally doubled the size of the U.S. after the Senate ratified it. So the explorers that were sent off to look at the new Louisiana Territory were Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. So Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore. Lewis led what he called the Corps of Discovery from St. Louis, Missouri to the Pacific Coast. So Lewis was a personal secretary to Jefferson, and Clark was an Army officer. This was a scientific exploration of the trans-Mississippi West. The Corps of Discovery was 28 men who accompanied Lewis and Clark, and they left in May of 1804 to the Pacific and made it to the Pacific in November 1805, barely surviving the Rocky Mountains and running extremely low on food and supplies. Their exploration gave us maps, knowledge of the Indians, overland trail to the Pacific. Jefferson wanted to find the Northwest Passage. He wasn't willing to give up on that yet. The U.S. also claimed the Pacific Northwest, thought that the Missouri River went all the way to the Pacific. So Sacagawea became the interpreter and guide for Lewis and Clark. She had a knowledge of trails and the mountain passes, which helped with the success of the expedition. She also became a diplomat for Lewis and Clark, and many tribes had never seen white men before. So she was seen as peaceful, especially when she was carrying her baby. So the discoveries were incredibly helpful to the new nation, and also to establishing our claims in the Louisiana Territory. Okay, now we're getting back a little bit to politics and Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. So, yeah, Burr was a Federalist. and the Federalists were afraid that the Louisiana Territory would become dominated by the Jeffersonian Republicans. They tried to elect Vice President Aaron Burr as the governor of New York as an independent. Hamilton said Burr was, quote, a dangerous man and one who ought not to be trusted with the reins of government. Jefferson ended up endorsing the Republican candidate, and Burr lost. Burr blamed Hamilton for his loss. So Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel on July 11, 1804. Hamilton fired first, but intentionally missed as a demonstration of his religious and moral principles. Burr shot Hamilton in the hip. The bullet ripped through his liver and lodged in his spine, and he ended up dying the next day. Moving on to other international disputes. The Barbary Pirates. The U.S. made numerous blackmail or tribute payments to the Barbary Pirates in exchange for the captured American ships and crews. So remember, we talked about the Barbary Pirates during Washington's administration? This is a continuation of those problems. In 1801, the ruler of Tripoli upped his blackmail demands and declared war on the U.S. Jefferson sent warships to blockade Tripoli. Finally, in 1805, this whole blockade and issue ended with Lieutenant Stephen Decatur slipping into Tripoli harbor and lighting the Philadelphia, which was a U.S. ship, on fire, causing the Tripoli ruler to settle for $60,000 ransom for the release of the ship's crew, which was a lot less than he was asking for. So you can see the Barbary Pirates taking the white men into slavery and the attacks on the ships. So Napoleon fought Britain and most of continental Europe in the Anglo-French War. So this was all going on while we were trying to establish our nation. In 1806, British warships began seizing American merchant ships headed for France. And so Congress responded with the Non-Importation Act, which banned British goods in 1806. The British were still impressing American sailors, even though they promised they would stop. The Chesapeake incident happened in 1807, so Napoleon announced that the French warships would blockade the ports of Great Britain. Great Britain responded that they would no longer allow any foreign ships to trade with French-controlled islands in the Caribbean. Soon after, British warships appeared along the American coast, stopping and searching U.S. merchant vessels as they headed to the Caribbean or Europe. So the impressment of sailors was when British warships stopped U.S. vessels, boarded them, and kidnapped sailors that they claimed were British citizens. In the Chesapeake incident, the British warship Leopard stopped the Chesapeake 8 miles off the Virginia coast. The Chesapeake's captain refused to let them aboard to search the ship, and the Leopard opened fire without warning, which killed 3, wounded 18, and then the British seized 4 men. So then after that came the Embargo Act in December of 1807. Jefferson and Madison, the Secretary of State, mistakenly thought that the embargo would stop Great Britain and France from violating U.S. rights. The value of U.S. exports plummeted from $48 million in 1807 to $9 million in 1808. Americans were really angry. It essentially stopped all exports of American goods, greatly hurt the American shipping and economy. New Englanders hated Jefferson. They called him Mad Tom. And it ended up getting repealed in 1809, which ultimately leads to the election of 1808 between Madison, Pinckney, and Clinton, which we will cover in our next notes.